So, hello and welcome to this conversation between Lynette Yiadom-Boakye and Josef Helfenstein. I'm so pleased to see so many of you here, especially on a gorgeous day like today. I hope you will have had a chance before the talk, and if not before, then after, to take a peek upstairs at the gorgeous exhibition, all the more glimmering for the natural light that's coming in at the moment. I have before me two people who maybe at this point need no introduction, but nevertheless, I will just say a few words to introduce our guests. Josef Helfenstein, the Lucerne-born former Menil Collection director, is now the new director, as you know, of the Kunstmuseum. And he's spoken to me about how important a place Kunsthalle Basel has been for him when he was a young man, the train rides he took from Lucerne to see shows here. So since his arrival, I had been wanting to find a way to extend a proper welcome to him and to highlight something that I've understood remains very important to us both, and that is continuing the incredible tradition that we have here in Basel of the importance of visual culture. Both preserving its history, but also nourishing its future, so that it can become part of history. And this moment, this exhibition, seemed the perfect opportunity to do that. We've organized this conversation between him and the artist of our current exhibition, Lynette Yiadom-Boakye, who was born in 1977 in London, of Ghanaian descent. She is, in addition to being a painter, also a writer and a poet, and there are a few publications available in the bookshop about her, each of which contains some of her writing. So it's in them that you can see the proof of what she described as her practice of painting what she cannot write and writing what she cannot paint. Now, I know that many of those catalogs were sold out already on the opening night, but if you're interested and if you'd like to know more about her work, you can always leave your name and contacts with the bookshop because we're getting more in on Monday. This conversation is one of many different kinds of events we have here at Kunsthalle Basel. Amongst the dozens and dozens of book launches, performances, lectures, tours, and other events we organize to accompany, mediate, and take you as a public with us on the journey that is the art that we're showing here. What we do is we highlight, I would say, the most interesting, promising, experimental of contemporary production, and it means an art of very different kinds. If you've come to Kunsthalle before, you may have seen performance, video, installation, sculpture, art that might even look like it's at the very limit of what you think art is, but it also includes painting. And today, it's our incredible honor to have this first institutional solo show, A Passion to a Principle, upstairs. Now, it might not seem immediately obvious to some why I brought these two individuals together. So I should say a word about that. It was a moment that I understood that Lynette had not only trained classically as a painter at the Royal Academy of Arts in London, but it was once when she was describing how important museums were to her education, how the act of learning to paint at an art school only brought you so far, but it was through the process of being at museums, looking at painting, studying the great masterpieces that are in public collections that helped her to learn the true techniques that she honed in her art. And so hers is a practice that demonstrates how important museums are as tools for artists, how vital a resource they are for us even today. And it's for that very reason that I thought to bring these two together, and I thank them for so generously offering to do that, accepting the invitation. Lynette, as you will see, speaks so beautifully about her technique, her process, and her work. It's a real treat to have her with us today, so I'm happy she agreed to stay on after her opening. And to Josef, of course, for accepting the invitation. I should say one last word. When I was thinking about this talk today, I was reflecting on exactly what I said, how important museums are to the next generation of artists. But it was when I was upstairs in the galleries looking at the paintings one last time before gathering here, that I thought it might be important to say as well that this relationship between contemporary art and between history and museums is not just a one-way street, of course. It's not just that artists look to the past, learn from it, and even revitalize it, but they might effectively help us to look better at that past. They might help us to look at our representational structures, the narratives of art history, how history is represented. So in that way, Lynette's work, like many young artists, in looking at the past, they also help us look towards the future. And so it feels all the more important to have two institutions like ours that show us and celebrate the enormous responsibility that we have in preserving the past, but also looking towards how the past can be rethought every single day. So without further ado, I'd like to give the word to my guests so that their conversation can begin. And I'm here to jump in at any moment. Thank you.
Thank you. So, by the way, there's 2 more seats here. If people are standing in the back, there's at least 2 more seats. So if you want, you can have a seat. I thought it would be interesting maybe to start to talk about how you hung your paintings, how you made the installation, because I am kind of struck. I think it's very intentional, it's very precise, and the paintings are hung very low. Even when I went back again, I realized that you're actually looking down to some of the works, like Heron, the head of that man. You're really looking down to him. To others, you're looking up, but they're low, and there is a reason for that.
Yeah, I'm very, very selfish when it comes to hanging the work, because I'm quite short, so I do everything in the way that I'm going to see it best. That's part of it, but I think also it actually stems from when the first few times I would give the work to people to hang and I wasn't there, they had this very natural classical inclination to hang everything quite high so that you're looking up. And I remember that was how I first saw El Greco hung in the Prado. And I remember being really angry because I couldn't see anything properly. And it was like this, and my neck hurt, and I couldn't see the work, and the light was really intense, way too intense in a way to be able to see the work properly. It drowned everything out. And so from there, and from all the instances of walking into a space where I hadn't been there and they're hanging my work, and thinking, I want to tear everything down and like by about, this much, and I can't. That frustration led me to think, actually, in future, I'm going to hang the work at a level that I can see it. And it actually didn't occur to me so much that tall people would be looking down. But they're not my problem. The world seems to be weighted towards tall people. So this is for short people. And I think the main thing is I want to be able to look into something, so that I always hang at the level at which, the space at which I made the work, which is sort of at my eye level. And I think I like that proximity. I don't like the effect of looking up at something. I want to look straight into it. So that was the main reason with the height, because it really affects how you read the work, I think.
Is there a physical? We at the Manil collection we had a policy or a philosophy really to hang lower than other museums. Also, it was remarked upon, and people realized it, and artists commented a lot on it. And I found it always very important to have this sort of physical relationship, not just the brain, but something more physical. Does it have to do with that too, or?
Yeah, because I think the physicality. I've started to think more and more about how I tend to when I'm working, I tend to forget about myself a little bit. So more and more I'm realizing that I'm spending maybe 10 hours a day standing up. And it's only the moments where I suddenly think, oh God, I'm really tired, I need to sit down, that I realize I haven't sat down maybe for 5 of those hours. I've literally been standing up because I'm so engrossed. And that's actually a sign that things are going quite well. If I sit down a lot, it usually means there's something wrong. So I've become more and more aware of the physicality of actually doing it and actually making something. And then when I bring it out of the studio, often it's the first time I really see it properly, because it's not a big studio and it's hard to see everything properly, but also that the way I relate to it physically changes as well. So something I have to be quite wary of is scale, because there's a very natural, I'm very naturally centering everything, because it's just how my mind works. And often I find that the head, I'll work on a series of things and then I'll look at everything and realize that the head is in the same position in every single canvas. And I think, oh, this is madness. It's like the scale doesn't shift. And so then you find you need to change gear in some way. And again, that means realigning your body and your physicality to it, to make a head that's the size of another body, or like the head is at one end and the legs, where the feet appear is very different to maybe the previous work. So there's all these things I have to remind myself of, because I think you have natural tendencies to do things a certain way.
So there's relationships between the paintings, obviously.
Yeah.
And I was surprised, and maybe others too, that there are even diptychs. That is a classical form of, organizing paintings, and also kind of establishing almost like not a hierarchy, but establishing certainly a relationship.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about your diptychs, that at least some of them don't look like diptychs, like the one in the last room, that's a diptych, the two portraits, the girl and the boy. The girl is cropped here, and also, and both of them are actually cropped.
Yeah.
So how do you establish diptychs? How did you come about this term?
Well, sometimes they're really, what's the word? It's something I have to remind myself I can do to solve a problem. So sometimes it's very intentional, like with the two dancers. That was very intentional, although there's a gap of maybe 2 weeks between them, of making them, because, anyway, I'll start from the beginning. Basically, those paintings were meant to be one painting, and it should have been 2 women in that same position, but they're holding on like that. But it went horribly wrong. So in my frustration, I trashed it and thought, well, I can't have this work in the show, and I really wanted this work in the show. And so I decided instead to do, because they kind of belong to a series, these dances on green. There's been a few others, previous works that follow a very similar formula. And I really wanted one in the show, but I wanted it to be this 2-person piece. And so I thought, well, I'll just do the one person, and then that will have to do, because I really want this in. And then I thought, why not just actually make it into a diptych? Because the problem with the initial one was that there wasn't enough space on the canvas. The canvas wasn't big enough. And I didn't just want to keep going bigger and bigger and bigger, because the door is only of a certain size in the studio. To get it out would mean taking it off the canvas, and all, and sometimes it's not necessarily the size that's the issue, it's the scale. So it doesn't have to be a physically massive canvas. It's what's on that canvas that becomes large or small, or that contracts or expands. So I thought, actually just make it a diptych to solve that problem, and it worked a lot better. So that was that one, and then the
2 dancers are
the
other diptych, the green dancers.
Yeah, and then the 2 white ones, the cropped things were actually, they weren't initially intended to go together, but then I didn't like them separately. And also there's this thing I realized I do where I don't really put...
There's a tension between the two. No?
Yeah, there's a
interesting,
tension.
yeah.
And I like that a lot. And so
the girl is smiling and the boy
Yeah.
is, it's not so clear
it's
what
kind
he's
of
doing.
smirking or something.
Yeah.
And so I didn't like them as much separately as I did together, and they did something very different. And also, because it's very rare that I put men and women together in one painting.
I wanted to ask about that. That's very rare, yes.
Very rare. So this was a way of doing, and I've done this before where I've had it's just something about putting them on the same canvas jars with me, but somehow if there's a little gap between them, it doesn't bother me so much.
So is there is there a distinction of representation in terms of males and females?
There is somewhere in my head. I'm not really sure how I'd characterize it, other than to say that with groupings, I still haven't necessarily found many ways to put men and women together on the same one. Because there's something I don't know. I feel I don't have the same freedom of reading yet, in terms of like there's a certain type of narrative that often goes with a male and a female together that I'm not as excited about as other types of narrative. Maybe that's how
I think it's interesting, and I think you don't have to justify. It's your decision, and it's an interesting decision. But I wonder about, this is kind of a taboo, but are you interested in beauty? I know beauty is not an issue in certainly contemporary art, but there is certainly a lot of there's beauty in your paintings. I think clearly, the gesture, the brush strokes, the kind of the way you create environments, the way you distinguish the figure and the background, the way you kind of keep your figures, because they're not portraits, out of being too overdetermined, too overdefined. So, could you talk about, is that completely absurd to talk about beauty?
No, it's really nice. I agree. I think it's a really hard thing to talk about, because it's, I don't see beauty necessarily as frivolous.
Yeah.
I think it's very powerful. I think it's not linear. It's many things, and it's. I think certainly my generation, when I was at art school, it became a very awkward thing to use or to think about or to do, or kind of a bit wimpy, a bit navel-gazing, a little bit perverse in a way. Maybe that's just the art school I went to, but I also think that there's really a space for it that, in a way, says as much somehow about politics, about ugliness in a way, and about hatred, and about everything else that and about power that you can. I think it's just about how you employ it.
Yeah, oh sure. It's very, very political, the way beauty is used in advertisement, and like living in the US for quite some time, you see it even more. There's something brutal and very aggressive, how so-called beauty is sort of instrumentalized, and and I feel like you're trying to avoid that, of course. You're keeping your figures out of the narrative, out of the biographical, out of the real, in a way, because they're not portraits. Maybe you should talk about how you create your persons, your people, your figures.
Yeah, I mean, they're very much composed of different sources and a lot of imagination, but working with drawing from life, from in sketchbooks, but also from things I collect, scrapbooks I make, and so there's this real sense of composing something as a painting, very much as an object that's got to have the qualities of a painting, but then also you are slightly playing God, building these figures out of something, but they're really built out of the paint and built out of a number of gestures or different ideas about figuration. So I don't really, I stopped seeing them in the same way as, I stopped seeing them as portraits a very long time ago. Somehow they just became something else. And
Does it have to do with the fact, and now I'm interpreting, and maybe this is art historians kind of, creating stories that don't exist, but in a way, by avoiding to define them in a strict way, like portraits are usually allusions to real people and real things, you keep it. You kind of keep it. You give it more freedom. You keep it out of this kind of the meaning thing. You have the aura of the work. The aura of the figure remains larger in a way. It's not a certain person. You can't sort of jump to Donald Trump or I don't know who. It's not. It's not about people. It's not about real people.
Yeah, definitely. I think I realized very early on that I wasn't as interested in people as I was in paintings. So my first few attempts, I learned how to paint people, paint from a sitter. I know technically, physically I could do it, but it wasn't ever satisfying to me. It didn't work because... And that was the fact that I was never happy with the outcome was a sign that this wasn't the point for me, because there's something about, when you look at someone and try and capture something of a person's essence, it's something that John Sargent did very well, that kind of, that ability to capture.
Yeah.
And I think that was a very different, how can I say, kind of purpose to mine, which was more along, I was always thinking much more about how is a painting constructed and what can a figure do or what can it be in that picture plane? What does a gesture mean? What does a color next to another color do? These were the things I was more obsessed with in a way, or thinking about in just purely in terms of process.
And nevertheless, I think I'm not the only one to kind of feel or have the impression that these people are kind of real. I mean, they're not completely, they're not robots. They're people.
No. They're believable, I would say.
They're
credible.
Yes, and there's even a strong intensity of how they are. The way they gaze, the way they look. Not outside of the painting, the way they rest, the way they're kind of in suspension. It's always
I think it's a lot to do with the fact that oil paint itself has a very human, visceral, flawed, filthy kind of character to it that's very much alive. It's not. It's naturally occurring substances that rot. I mean, they corrode, they rot, a bit like people. And they can be corrosive, as too can people, poisonous, toxic, just like people. But that the paintings actually themselves have this, they take on this kind of realness in themselves as objects, so that when I approach the whole thing, there's another kind of realness that comes through that's about those flaws, about those mistakes, so it becomes less about the outline and more that the outline or the subject in a way, and more about that object and the capturing a certain type of humanity in an object. That the image is obviously a big part of that, but it becomes an image because of what it's made of, and that for me is why I paint rather than doing anything else.
Which really relates you to the history of painting. I mean, because I think that must be one of the reasons why painters have used oil paint and paint material really for many, many centuries and have created amazing things. By the way, I find it interesting that, your portraits that are not portraits when portraiture started, it was not about likeness. You know, before the Renaissance, the painters didn't have the means to create realistic portraits, and they didn't think about it. It was not their problem. And then, of course, in the Renaissance, it was all about individuals and people, emotions, interpretations of individuals. It was about the ego, the human person, and the importance of the human individual. And you have created like a balance between not creating portraits or not, you know, people, persons, but figures. And I find that very contemporary, you know, the kind of the lack of definition, you know, the media that are kind of taking everything away from us. They're stealing us from ourselves in a way. And in a way, I find your paintings kind of reflect, they seem to refer to that in a way. I mean, that's...
Well, there's something, I think it's another reason why maybe painting is so important to me, is just that there's, it's just going to sound so elderly to say, but I suppose I remember a world before technology, before excessive kind of stuff, these things that I you know, you can't put down. And I don't know, I grew up in a, I suppose it's harking back to something I always felt very strongly about, a certain type of simplicity or a certain type of approach to nature, or thinking about things and what one can do purely from one's imagination, or thinking about magic, or thinking about the things that you can't mechanize, the things you can't computerize, the things you can't
process. You can't process, yeah.
And the things you can't explain necessarily, the things you can't always put into words or rationalize. I had an argument with someone recently, actually a couple of people recently, about this, the need for logic in art, the need to be able to explain everything, the need for everything to make sense. And that was actually one of the reasons why I'm still alive, is the fact that everything doesn't make sense to me. I would feel, I think I'd lose my mind if everything made sense, because I'm there's that, if you don't, I don't know, if you don't have a certain level of wonderment still with everything that's going wrong around us in the world, I think you need, I feel like I need it more than ever, especially after last week. This being able to have a certain sense of wonderment, or something that still remains inexplicable, even though there is I don't know, this is crazy, I'm not making any sense. I'll let you ask another question.
I think it leads me to asking you about the relationship between poetry and painting. I mean, obviously, I've actually tried to memorize your titles, which I can't.
I can't.
But I went through your show just before this talk again, and just read the titles, looked at the sheet, and there's a. I think that's rare that you are definitely a writer, and you've written short stories and poetry-like literature, but then you're a painter, and obviously your titles are very specific, but they're also totally non-specific, but they're very precise in terms of words. So can you maybe talk about that relationship?
No, I love language. I've always loved words, and I never wanted a title to be an explanation or a description. So I more recently began to kind of, actually not more recently, I've always accepted somehow that the title can act as another brush mark. It can be a mark next to a painting or on the sheet rather than next to the painting, but another mark rather than anything like an explanation or a description. Because I think I see a writing practice and a painting practice for me are quite separate. They're not. Yeah. I don't really link them in any way apart from where I make the titles, and they're obviously attached to the works. But yeah, I've never wanted to explain. So there's something that I do whereby it's more about perhaps a series of thoughts that I've had in relation to a work that would make absolutely no sense and be absolutely no use to anyone as any kind of explanation. It's just when I don't know, somehow in the practice of making something, there are a number of thoughts that go through your mind, there are word associations, there are games, there are things people have said to you, there's sometimes you look at something and a phrase just comes into your mind and that becomes a phrase that sticks to the work. So it's very free for me in that sense. I think I suppose I've gotten less self-conscious about this ability to not explain, I think, in that way.
Yeah, and I can see that very strongly, that those, not only do they not explain, they also make it more enigmatic, your titles. You know, they almost open another dimension, intentionally, probably. Well, but there are some titles that are very intriguing, like, for example, one, the boy with, it's not a t-shirt, with the stripes, with the pullover, who raises his hands. It's called Witching Hour, which I saw today. I did read, only unfortunately I haven't had time to read a lot of your short stories, but that term I discovered in this story between, that's the fox and the hyena, yes?
Yes, that's right.
It's actually a cruel story about the discussion between two animals right before the day starts, and it ends cruelly, but yeah.
As most of them do. I should come to that story in a minute. But those paintings, because the men in the striped tops are a recurrence, so there's always there's a lot of them out there, and it's something I always used to return to. There was that painting, and then there was another one of a smiling man. These two paintings that I used to start every body of work with. These two paintings, because somehow there was something in them that was like a reminder of my something. They were like friends. I don't know, it was like bringing... I mean, it reminds me of Yan Peiming, a Chinese artist who said that every morning he goes to the studio and paints Chairman Mao as a way of as a warm-up every day. It's a very strange thing to do every day, but he goes in and paints Chairman Mao, and I thought, in my way, he is my Chairman Mao in a way. Not every day, but every body of work. It's it's kind of a reminder of something. And pictorially, I've just always loved this this formation of the stripes, and it's usually blue and white, but there's been red and white as well, and then this very flat background. And that each one of them, because they began to signify to me something, a very particular time of the day or night. And so each one of them had the title of, had a day of the week, usually at the weekend, and then a time during the hours of darkness. And they became sort of an allegory for me of the night and the weekend. But
And so the fact that he's flanked by two dancers on the left hand.
Oh no, that was purely just something that happened up there. That was just, I like the formation of the three. But for me, at this point, I think I've run out of times and days. Somehow there's been so many of them that the witching hour, I knew I hadn't used it. I couldn't remember which ones I'd used or not used, because I have a very bad memory and no proper record of anything. So the witching hour, I knew I hadn't used, and I know that it counts for midnight, but it's another way of expressing midnight.
I was not aware of that. My English is still not good enough to realize that, but you just told me that, yeah. And the dancer right to it is maybe, it kind of reminds us, many of us maybe, of Degas, which is one of the artists you have been interested in. And I find the title there is especially interesting. The title is Militant Pressure, I think, yeah, that's and although you use language kind of in the same way as paint, you know, don't let yourself sort of be pushed into a meaning or into a box or into some kind of prison of meaning. But militant is a strong word, so it kind of one associates with militant,
Yeah.
you know, politics and pressure even more so. So I think that's a very interesting title, Militant Pressure.
Yeah. I think it's part of I wanted to use the word pressure again because there was a series of titles. An early one was Pressure from Cannibals.
Actually,
And
the
then,
woman on the left of the striped boy, the title is Pressure from a Didact.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
the word is present.
Yeah, I wanted to make this connection as well. I
mean, you don't have to explain it, but I'm kind of maybe indicating that there is the language too is very intentional, I think.
Yeah.
It's very,
And
you know how
recurring.
to use words.
And intentional and recurring. So there are patterns that start to form between works and how they've been titled. So as I was saying about the striped men, but also the certain words that recur. So, and also the sound of words. So the I can't remember what it's called. Harp strum.
Yes, the other diptych, the two dancers. Yeah.
And that again links to another the same series of Dancers on Green. I think there's match struck, trap sprung. It's something about how words feel in your mouth as well.
Yeah. When do you create your titles? Does it happen after the painting process, or during, or often after?
Often after. Very occasionally, no, actually never really before. Or often during, but mostly after.
Yeah, okay. Do you want to say something about color, sort of the palette, which to me is a striking kind of characteristics of your work?
Yeah.
Obviously, you know how to use color, but still you seem to have preferences for certain colors. And maybe it would be interesting for people to hear about how
I've never been very confident with color. I never had, like I was saying, art school, they don't, in fact, I think I'd say with art school, they pretty much go out of their way not to teach you anything. Because it's safer that way, it's better. There was a time when you had a really strong sense of house styles, and people wanted to get away from that way of doing things and having, the atelier with the master. It was just like beating everyone and shouting at them and telling them they'll never amount to anything. So it's gone completely the other way, whereby they don't teach you anything.
Yeah.
So you kind of need to go in and ask them, tell them what you want to know. And I always remember one of my favorite tutors at the RA coming in and saying, and he was a very, very elegant, incredible, French-raised. He was from, I think his father was from the West Indies and his mother was French, but he was raised in Paris and came in and cigarette in hand just said, you apply your eyeshadow more interestingly than you use color. And that this was the best thing anyone ever told me, because actually it made me go and think about my eyeshadow as well. But I realized I would just slap colors on next to each other and hope for the best, because I think, okay, I like this color, I'm going to make it work, I'll use it, I'll put it on, and it never really worked because there was no relationship at all. And then so over time I realized that actually it's all those things that you learn really, really early on when they're still teaching you stuff in art class when you're at, I really would pay attention in art class at school, because that's when they actually, it's still okay to teach you stuff. So you'll do the color wheel, you'll do the thing with you learn about primary colors, secondary colors, tertiary colors. And actually all that stuff is basically what I use now. All the stuff I learned when I was maybe 16 that I thought I wouldn't really need again. And that was the last time I had proper education, I think. You realize that all of those relationships are why colors work or don't work together. It's why a painting works or doesn't work. And it's really complicated, and I could talk about it for hours and bore you all to death, but I won't do it. But basically, when you start, I came to realize that no color is a standalone color. Colors don't react unless there's something next to them. Like, you know, or they only react with what's next to them. So I'm looking at the lady in the front with the red, but I'm realizing that the red in her jacket is a very different red to the overcoat jacket. So the blazer is a much warmer red, but maybe it's because of the gentleman next to her who's wearing a powder blue, and then you see the orange more in that red because of the blue that's next to it. And then I'm also thinking, well, again, the contrast, maybe he's more powder blue because he's blonde, and then there's a black next to that, which is kind of also pushing him. So you start to see that nothing on its own is a color. Everything is relating to something else. So and it's the same thing on a canvas, so you have to make everything, you have to make these relationships, or the color doesn't work, it doesn't do anything, when you want something to jump forward or recede, you have to think about what's next to it. It's so simple, but it's only occurred to me in the last few years.
Well, it does not look like it only occurred to you in the last few years.
It really, I mean, I think I must have been winging it for so long because you just don't stop and think about these things. And so now when I'm teaching, I'm trying to tell painting students this, and some of them get very excited and very happy, and like a light goes on. Some of them just look at me like I'm so boring, and like, why are you telling me this? I want to be an art star. I don't care about anything. And then just like, and try and tell them, no, you can't paint until you know this. Unless you're painting in even black and white. I mean, even thinking about how do you call it, chromatic grays, and how even if you're painting monochromatically, there are color values in that, you know. So
well, I think you are, and you seem to be especially talented to work with these dark colors and to kind of show us that blacks are not blacks. There's 100 different, kinds of blacks or browns or. So maybe we could move into, I don't know what's showing here, but yesterday we made a walk through the Kunstmuseum because I was interested in having your kind of reactions to works, and we had a very interesting moment together, and I think we've chosen some of the works, and do they show up here?
You can see that we can't.
Yeah, so maybe we could talk about a few of those, because I think what's really interesting is that you, as a young woman, as a young black woman, you're really continuing tradition of painting in a way, and you're inserting yourself into, or you're continuing the tradition of painting, and I think it's extremely interesting, and the way you reacted to certain paintings. So I don't know what is up there right now.
What's it look like?
I don't know.
It's a test of your art history skills.
Okay, it's like,
and how
guess
well
which
you know
one. Oh, it's me
museum.
on there. It's still me. It's
you.
yeah.
Okay, that's good. So, maybe you have seen, like, one of the paintings you chose was this, the bouquet, the floral still life by Courbet.
Yeah.
Which I thought was very interesting. It's a painting that it's certainly maybe one of our most beautiful Courbet. It's rather small. It's a rather traditional painting of, and I didn't realize yesterday that, I don't know if you remember, but it was actually dedicated to Baudelaire.
Oh wow!
It's dedicated to Baudelaire, so which makes it really interesting.
Yeah.
And it's from '59, I think the painting, and Baudelaire published Les Fleurs du Mal in '57. So it's probably that's the reason why he chose this floral thing and gave it to Baudelaire. And so it has a very interesting history.
That makes me like it even more.
Yeah.
I love
so
that.
maybe
I
tell
love
us
that
about
book.
the Courbet.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting, this link with Baudelaire, who I was reading a few months ago again, actually. But this kind of, I'm always thinking about the time of these paintings somehow, and the kind of the kind of filthiness of I guess the world, society they were living in at the time, and the way that they lived, and just how, in some ways, that permeated the paintings themselves. So I was really drawn to that. It's just the contrast. I mean, the color being so true and so rich and so kind of, and yet and really also the marks. I mean, because I think it was next to the Delacroix. Is that right?
It's in the same space. Yes.
And I get
yes.
that. I was looking really across the two and thinking about how rough these marks were for such a delicate thing.
I was also I thought, well, this is in a way there's a similarity to your work. You know, the dark background, this kind of richness of the dark background. It's not just a flat black; it's really rich and deep. And then this beautiful writing of Courbet to Baudelaire, and of course the flowers. You know, flowers come and die very fast. It's really not permanent flowers. And
something of that. Yeah, just that. Because there's a delicacy to it, but it's also just so heavy and strong and relentless. And if you look at it too long in some parts, it becomes quite ugly. It becomes quite kind of, it breaks apart. It's how, I suppose it's thinking again about this mark making, like how when you look at something long enough, it starts to disintegrate.
Yeah.
But it makes me want to ask, when one has looked through your oeuvre, even your earliest works, one doesn't find a still life or flowers or other things than these human figures. And of course in school I can imagine you learn by, on the one hand copying, on the one hand sort of a rote exercise of trying to imitate the masters. But then once you had defined your own particular style and voice in painting, you made the choice to paint only figures.
Yeah, because I think for me there was never, technically in my head or when I look at other people's paintings, I don't see that much of a difference. I always think that, what's his name? Lucien Freud, I always think makes everyone look kind of dead. Which I love it for that, but they do look, the bodies look dead. I mean, they look like they've kind of, and then they become like still lives to me, that this kind of, they're so heavy and so kind of, you know, dead, that they become, you know, something like a bunch of flowers actually starts to look more alive, starts to look more like a person, and while these figures end up looking more like dead objects. And so I trained, going back to when I was having real training when I was at school, we did used to draw from a still life for like 6 weeks at a time. Just go in every art lesson was just another reiteration of this huge still life. And I think mainly the point of that exercise was always to learn how to use your eyes, and that anything you are doing, anything you're painting or drawing, whether it's a still life or a figure, the main thing is that you're spending more time looking at the thing than you are at the canvas or at the paper, because that's how you get the closest likeness. That's how you really see, is by spending most of your time looking and less of your time mark making. And so I never really felt that there was that much of a difference, but on the occasions more recently where I tried to focus on, say, painting a vase of flowers, I find I start to fidget. I get very twitchy. I can't focus properly. I get a bit skittish. I suppose because of the way I think in color or tone or form, I always like the object, whether it's not object, the non-human entity in the painting to be somehow in relation to a person.
Mm-hmm. Which it is in your case. Now, I mean, you have started to paint animals.
Yeah.
The bird, almost not visible, and of course the kind of a pheasant.
Peacock?
Yeah, the peacock.
Peacock. But then you chose people when
Yeah.
we walked. I think there's only portrait, or not portraits, but many portraits. There's that actually that amazing painting by Van Gogh.
Yeah, the woman at the piano.
Madame Gachet,
Yeah.
paint at the piano, which and maybe this is a really interesting parallel. Did you know that he painted this painting in 2 days?
Oh no, I didn't.
We know that because he wrote many letters. And you're painting your paintings in 1 day or not more than 2, no?
Generally not. No.
Yeah. So the fast creation is part of the concept, really. And I found that really kind of amazing. And there's a story behind that. It's actually a touching painting. It's a beautiful work.
It was the doctor's wife.
Yes, no, his daughter.
Daughter.
His wife had died, and so she's the daughter. And he apparently had romantic feelings for this young woman, and she did not want to be engaged in those feelings. But then he gave her that painting. It's a gift to her, and it's kind of wonderful that story around the painting. And then they kept it for a long time. The Kunstmuseum approached the Gachet family and bought it in the 30s.
Oh wow.
And it's here now, so yeah. Why did you choose that?
I love I suppose again it's that thing of having how an object or the surroundings start to affect the figure, so that you're very aware that she's kind of quite her position is very much in relation to this object, so she's kind of following the line of it. But also the mark is really uniform all the way through. It's like he had one brush and just went all the way through it. And I thought it's just amazing because it's completely directional. So the whole thing is described by direction because there isn't much color variation in each object. So you very much read the skirt as a kind of a series of marks that go like that, and then she's seated, and you get the sense of this heaviness in her being sat on something. But then somehow there's light in it. I don't know. It's such a it's a really odd painting. I think it's a really odd one. I mean, I don't tend to do so many detailed interiors because I try to avoid the very specific references to time in the work. And obviously, if you have an interior, then you have furniture which has a style which relates to a particular time. And so, if I have a piece of furniture, it's usually a very generalized table or chair-looking object that could be anything, anytime. So it's really interesting for me to look at these very detailed interiors and how they make you think about time. I mean, in a way, the dress is the indicator of time, but a piano, in some ways, in the same way as a peacock, is timeless. You know that the pianos have been around for a very long time. People still use them today as they used them 100 years ago. You don't really get that same time shift thing, but so it was interesting to me for that as well.
Yeah. What about the Picasso? It was clear you wanted to, you commented on that one. Yeah. It's the Arlequin from 1923, which you probably have seen. And there's amazing. A big story, but most people here know that, so we don't need to repeat that.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary painting.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that was the period of, in Picasso's oeuvre that I really loved. It was like, the blue and the pink periods were really those are the paintings that I loved the most. But what I loved most about this one was just the use of line, the use of color, and it's kind of unusual. For me, it feels quite unusual. I don't think I've seen this before in his work. This a very particular approach to this rose pink. And also the use of line being quite, pronounced in a really different way.
The paint is very thin, and therefore the line is also almost like sketchy. It's like a pen or so, like ink. And so the painting has this strange kind of ambivalence between a painting and a drawing.
Yeah, and the gaze as well is.
And the gaze
really
goes.
Bizarre,
yeah, the gaze is like in your paintings.
Yeah, it's
sort of out. Yeah.
Kind of out and away. It's just really, it really struck me. I think it's
It's actually
it's extraordinary.
a friend of his who was a painter who's portrayed, so it's a portrait. But of course he put these clothes on him, and there's sort of a historicizing commedia dell'arte or whatever, Arlequin clothing.
Yeah.
But maybe, what about the Corot? I mean, we have two works by Corot that should also be scrolling down there. That's kind of an artist that is less in the focus of the art market, and
I think it's really, I don't know, for me it's so underrated in a way, because they're just, again, they're really, there's such a strong sense of the painterliness in them. You know, the such a strong mark making, and the figure with the reclining figure painting that we took. Again, it was that sort of thing that I was looking at for a lot of the works that I was doing with the reclining men upstairs, and then a recent show. And it was, again, it struck me because of this, that there's a real economy to the mark making. There's not a lot there. There's not a lot of information. It's not as heavily worked. And yet it's all there somehow. And also this contrast between the tones, you know, the thinking about how I try to construct paintings, really thinking about working from the dark to the light, so coming forward in a way that you map out the darkest tones in the painting, and then introduce the light as you come forward, because if you do it the other way around, it goes muddy. It's a really simple thing they tell you at school. But, you know, that contrast, again, and that allowance of economy, you know, allowing yourself not to put everything there, or not to overwork something, as a way of actually saying more, or doing more, and leaving that space for the imagination.
Yeah. There's one painting there that is a little bit more narrative than these sort of non-narrative portraits, or that still life, which is the portrait of, or the painting, Hodler painting his lover dying. You know, the woman really basically on the transition between life and death. With her mouth. It's a very shocking, it's a very powerful painting. And that's...
Yeah, it's extraordinary, because it reminded me of so many things. I think I saw a version of it in New York, and if I'm not mistaken, it was in the show, I think it was a show called The Unfinished Show. And I may have completely made this up, but I think there was another section in that show. Am I thinking of two different shows at once? There was another section in that show that was thinking very much about death, particularly about the period in the 80s when many gay men in New York were dying of AIDS, and people didn't know what was happening, and there was this confusion, and a lot of artists who made work at that time. And I think there was maybe I was thinking very much of something else that I saw in that room, and just the power of that. Somehow that painting was as just hit me and stayed with me in the same way that many of the photographs in there of men of this time. There's another artist, I want to say David Wojnarowicz, but I don't think it was his. Was it his? It may have been some photos that he'd made, and there was just something really you see as being so timeless. I think when you start to think about death and the way that the way that artists have tried to think about that, or depict it in some way, or get across this sense of this time when someone's moving out.
And maybe that's a topic that I don't know how much time we have, but I think it would be fascinating, because I believe that's what painting can do more than photography, for example. Sort of condense time, you know, it's not just a moment in time like often photography is, or film, and many pictures, but you kind of construct time, you condense it, you consolidate it, you you make something, I mean, and that's what I see in that painting, the Hodler painting.
Yeah.
And I see that in your works too, that there is a strong sense of time, sort of suspension of time, concentration of time, packaging time, but in not, you know, in some way that only painting can do. Can you?
Yeah, and the kind of urgency as well.
Yeah,
I mean, I think
sure.
if I think about that painting, or and the urgency that was behind that painting, you know, to make that and accomplish it, because the time was not, it was finite. It was there was, you know, and in the sense that urgency that I tend to work in as well, and I don't know whether, part of me doesn't know where that comes from, but it is again linked to a sort of sense of impending mortality or something that that I'm quite impatient in that way about making, about getting something out, and I think it's. Yeah, maybe all artists have this with time somehow.
Yeah,
limitation
sure.
of time.
Well, you definitely have it. I think time is it's something very strong, I believe, because these resting people or figures, and it's like as if time would have been excluded, but of course it's all the more present because it's excluded. And yeah, it's the time aspect is kind of an important thing about your work.
I would say both also between the way in which you deliberately leave a particular datedness or the possibility of dating when the people are standing, where they're standing, when they're standing. But also I wonder how this connects to a deliberate unfinishedness that exists in many of your paintings. And sometimes it's on, say, for instance, with the dancer, and this Degas reference that really looks as if quite a bit is unfinished, but then there are other paintings which might even be amongst the most finished looking upstairs, but then will leave little bits. I think of the boy holding the peacock who has the bit of paint missing in between his sort of the parts of his mustache or the tip of a nose that is left just without that last brush stroke that makes you feel as if the painter might come back. And
I don't know. It's something really pictorial, because I'd like to say it was always a psychological or an emotional or a logical thing, but I think it's just how you see something, and also the sense that I don't know if I don't know why this just came to me, but I don't even know if it's true, but this the myth about the woman from the, what film was it? The James Bond, Goldfinger, who was completely painted, and they didn't leave a gap, so she died, the one who was painted gold. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but there's something about closing up the whole, like painting that, covering the whole surface somehow, and not leaving anywhere for it to breathe, that for me almost can kill something, because I've done this before where I feel I've overworked something by one mark and it's gone wrong because I put that one last mark in, because I should have just left it. Because something about that, because I think you compensate with your eyes. If I think about a painter like Sickert and how much, the level of kind of economy he uses, and how you often do have these very improvised, very quick kind of marks that almost look pixelated, so when you're close up, you can't see anything until you get far back, and then the whole thing suddenly ties together and makes sense. And then I think it's almost like there's the famous one of this is an awful story, but the Sickert painting of the Danish whore, I think it's called something like that. It's got a really cynical. No, I'm thinking of someone else. La Belle Hollandaise was the nice one he did, I think, of a Danish hooker, and then there was another one of another prostitute who had basically lost a lot of her face to syphilis, and so there's this. It's a really terrifying painting because she's kind of sat there, had this weird foreshortening in the body, so she's kind of like that, and she's looking straight at you, and you see most of her face. Well, this part of her face, her nose is missing basically. But you kind of don't read it like that. you kind of see it as like a bunch of marks that he's just kind of done very, very quickly. But when you get close, when you get further away, you realize, oh my God, no, her nose is missing. It's not like it's not hidden in there somewhere in painterly marks. It's gone, and it's quite a sort of, it's really quite a terrifying painting. But it's amazing how he achieves that just with this, like a really strange economy of mark.
Which is really what the beginning of modernist painting was exactly about, the unfinishedness of a painting and the impossibility to actually want it or being able to finish something in the kind of classical sense with Manet and Cézanne, which there's also a portrait by Cézanne which is on this list.
I would just jump in to say I would love maybe to ask one question a bit to you both, but also to be able to open it up to the audience so that they might have a chance to ask some questions as well. I wanted to ask, maybe to you, Josef, something that this conversation has so beautifully made visible or palpable for me is how through the gaze of an artist or through the visit that you two had through the museums and the selections of works that you're now speaking about, I wonder how sort of an artist looking from the present might help an institution to look at your own collection and to look at juxtapositions and display. I wonder if this is something that that you do regularly, look at the museum with artists to see how they look.
Of course, that would be very stupid if I wouldn't do it. No, of course, I think we can learn more, at least as much from artists as we can learn from books or whatever. But I think you can also learn from people who never look at art, children or, young people or whoever. So, and artists, but of course artists are the critiques of institutions and I think it's always has always been extremely important to me to learn from artists, or like it's a special pleasure if you go through a collection like this one, which is so rich and so, but also so solid in a way and so settled that you unsettle a collection, you rediscover it by going through it with someone like you. So it's very important, I think, for museums to open themselves to artists, and I hope we can do that a lot here in my time at the Kunstmuseum.
Great. Well, we do have some wireless microphones in the room that if any of you should have questions, please feel free. It's your chance. Just raise your hand and...
My name is Jacqueline Burkhardt, and I'm from Parquet, and we are going to collaborate with Lynette, and we are so happy. And I have a question. Being such a fantastic painter, you do as well drawing and etching, and I wonder how this is such another relation to this medium, and you do it like writing, it's on the table, and it's not on a scaffolding, you say, or I don't know. So anyhow, I just wanted to hear you talk also about etching and drawing, which is did you go in the museum through this department also in your museum etchings, or in the Kunstmuseum? Did you look at
who's the artist?
Because
I'm not sure if I understood.
in grafische Sammlung.
The etchings of
in the
Anyhow, you're just a grafische Sammlung from the museum, which I wondered whether you had a walk through that also or not this time.
No, we didn't make it through those. I think I looked at them last time, though. There was some really extraordinary things I found there. But I find it really, really hard to work on the etchings because I have to sit still, and there's a lot of trial and error, and you can't control it like you can with everything else. But with painting, you have to, it's a lot of backwards and forwards. It's really quite labor intensive. If you, with the first etch, you get a certain something. Oh, went off for a minute. You get something, and then it's never quite right. Sometimes it's very wrong. Sometimes it's just one thing, it's just slightly, it just needs a bit more. So you go back and you work on it again, then it goes back in the acid, and if you leave it in too long, it starts to go bald. Every time you put it into the acid, it's still etching, even though you try and cover it. So it's maddening actually. I find it really hard, but then I also, in quite a perverse way, I like being forced to focus in a different way. I like the lack of control, and I like the fact that I have to do things properly. Like there's a guy I work with to make them, and when we're doing the edition, he's the clean hands, I'm the dirty hands, because I can't, I'm really untidy. I get marks all over everything. So it's like the opposite to what I do in my studio, which is much freer and much less regimented and much less ordered into a series of processes, which I enjoy, but I find it really hard. I have to almost recalibrate my brain to do it.
And I know that in the process of preparing this exhibition, you were, on the one hand, painting quite a lot to be able to complete the 24 works, 26 paintings that we have upstairs, but there were also moments when you were etching in between as a way of sort of stepping out of painting to another kind of mark, only to be able to go all the better back to it.
Yeah, no, it was helpful for that too, because the parquet edition had to be done. So I was doing that at the same time, and
so that was what you were etching.
What I was doing.
I didn't even know.
My name's Matthew. I was just wondering if you could say briefly something about the relationship between yourself and the models, the people that you're painting, maybe?
So if you could say something about the relationship of yourself to the models?
Or
the people that you're painting.
The people in the paintings. I don't know, because they're not done with models, so it's very. I've come to see them less and less like people, and more as paintings, if that makes sense. So I don't. I think that's why I don't work with models, essentially. It's weird. I mean, there's always certain things I'm trying to get out of a certain gesture or a look or a stance or a composition, but I don't. Someone asked me this the other day, if I give them names and stuff. I'm not that far gone. It hasn't come to that yet. I don't really see them like that. Yeah.
But I do nevertheless like the story. It may not be actually true, but I had read once that there was a certain gentleman that you were painting, or let's say a figure that you were painting, that had a sort of naughty sort of gaze, and you, while painting him, could imagine him as a gentleman friend, for instance.
Oh God, yeah. I used to say this all the time. It's terrible. I used to, when there was no boyfriend, I was painting myself boyfriends. That was my ideal men. These are all my ideal men, all of them. But there is, I don't know. It's there's something about. I was thinking about this the other day when someone asked me as well about painting men or painting women, and I think it is a very different set of rules or something I have buried away for men and women. That there's certain ways I probably would never paint a woman that I'm quite comfortable painting a man in that way. I don't know.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Another question, yes. And then a last one at the back.
And I want to thank you for this really rich and precious discussion. I have a question. I hope it's not too personal. For me, it's a cultural question. And it's if you're talking about colors, and you showing us your training in colors, and you never talked about the color of skin. And I'm asking because if you look in art history, you don't have many black people to study. And I know that, for instance, in art teaching, training, if we teach young people in art school, middle school as well, in portrait painting, then we realize this big missing of different colors of skin. And so sometimes I offer them portraits of you to study how a young black painter does deal with skin color. But I wanted to ask you, did you find models in European art history that were black?
I didn't. It's strange. I think for a lot of people, going to museums and looking at paintings as a child and seeing that there were no black figures, in a strange way, I noticed, but I didn't notice at the same time. There's something very odd, I think, when you're very young, that you're not necessarily, you're self-aware in certain ways and completely not in others. So you only really become aware of your difference when someone says something nasty to you. Like when someone calls you a nasty name or says, you black this, or so I think in that way I was kind of like, it didn't really occur to me until someone said it. And so when I went to museums a lot and I was looking at things, I was aware that all these people were white in the paintings, but I don't know what I was looking at, but I almost wasn't looking at that. So when I came to start painting figuratively, it just seemed really natural to me to paint what I knew best, or what I knew, and what I was, because I think without really making a very conscious decision to do that, because I think you work from your own experience. I grew up around with black people. My family are black, so it was never particularly an odd thing for me to do. It didn't seem revolutionary. It just seemed like, no, this is my world, essentially. I mean, it would be a lot stranger if I only painted white people. That would be very odd, indeed. And also, I kind of wasn't so much thinking about painting mixtures of people, because I thought that, in a weird way, for me, that seemed a little, I did, but in some ways it seemed a little tokenistic or something. Then it becomes about that. Mm-hmm. And so by removing that question, and basically doing exactly what I wanted to do, which is this, it kind of solved a lot of problems and meant I could think about everything it is to be coming from where I'm coming from. And that's not really, I don't necessarily believe in role models in the sense of saying like, oh yes, I'm this, that, and the other, therefore, but more in the sense that, you have a particular set of experiences that are completely your own, and you come from something that's completely your own, and that's the voice you speak with, that's the filter you take in the world, and you put things out into the world that are filtered through you. That's what art making is. And so, in a sense, my filter is always going to be black, female, born in London, raised in London by Ghanaian parents. That's my filter. I see the world as that person, and therefore, the work I do, I think, is a result of that. Mm-hmm. So rather than, I never thought in terms of anything being a specific logical decision. It's just, I do whatever I want to do, which is what I suggest everyone does as an artist, and don't try to. I've never really thought. People often say, "Oh, where do you fit into the canon?" And I think that sounds so grand. How dare I try and put myself into a canon? All I can say is like, these are the things that I love. These are the things that I have learned from. These are the things that have inspired me, and this is the position that I make work from, and that includes everything that I am and everything that I ever will be. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but that's yeah.
I think you really have, because I think you are in a way teaching us. I mean, what the lady says is true. It's conspicuous that there's so few Black people in the history of painting, although there are more than we think. And actually, when at the Menil collection we had a surprisingly big collection formed by the Du Menils. I don't know if you know about that.
I know, but I saw it. Yeah,
the image of the Black in Western art, which is a very interesting way to look at art through the history of race relations. And
I think there's one last question in the back by an artist. So if we could bring the microphone back there.
It's a pleasure to have seen your work, and pleased to meet you. I'm an artist living in Basel, and I would also like to thank the lady that spoke about the colors of the skin, because I'm interested in the color white in your work. And I realized that if I close my eyes a little bit, and if I'm looking at one of your works, also here from the back, the whites, they feel like shots. They are so strong that they feel like shots. I also realized that you leave bits of the canvas coming out, especially on the lines that encircle the patches of color that you use. So my question to you is related to the canvas and the whites. Do you start from color and then you include the white as color? Do you let the white of the canvas or the non-white of the canvas shining through? So in summa, please tell us about the white.
Yeah, no, the lightest point, I think it depends on whether it's the canvas or the linen, because the canvas is always primed white. So there's the rabbit skin glue, and then there's the white oil primer over the top. And I always try and keep wherever I want white, these flashes from behind. Often I really try and keep that white as true as possible. So the white of the primer coming through, because that's always the lightest point in the painting. But often that gets muddied out, so I have to work over it with a white, but usually, particularly with the eyes, I always want the white in the eye to be the white of the primer on the canvas. But with the linen, it's a kind of sort of chicken soup brown color to start with. So you kind of, it affects the way everything else works. It's still the lightest point. It's still the purest point because it's the ground. But there is, it's a very different set of, how should I say, actions or tonal relationships because of whether it's a canvas or a linen, because it kind of, it completely changes the way you work on it. I mean, the linen takes a lot longer to work on as well, so.
What I felt also while looking at your paintings, that this takes me beyond the painting, especially through the eyes, and you go absolutely through the paintings. So my question to you also is the relationship between the white and the abstraction in your paintings. Do you see it? Do you experience it in this way? Because it's mainly related to the gaze. And it's really pretty strong, especially if you close your eyes and see it from afar.
Yeah.
You really travel through the eyes there. And so this is pretty clear. Yeah.
I think the construction is always abstract because you I think you arrive at a figure, I don't really sketch it out and fill it in, so it's really a case of thinking tonally as well as in terms of color, just how you build something out of areas of tone. So it's definitely that. The construction is completely abstract. But I think it's more notable in there's one up there, I can't remember the title, but the man lying on the hammock, or who appears to be lying on a hammock.
Sermons for Heathens.
Sermons for Heathens, you know it. And if I think about the construction of that one, for example, which was a series of mistakes and irritations and problems and reworking so that the pattern in the hammock layered upon layered upon layered until it started to do something very strange to the eyes. And the white of the top on top of the man's sweater didn't necessarily match to that, apart from where you see the linen showing through. So there are all these, I think, visual tricks that definitely are, the whole thing is constructed very much more in the abstract than the figurative somehow.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, first of all, to both of you. This has been just an amazing additional mark alongside the marks upstairs to allow everyone here, and myself included, incredible insight into your thinking and process. And I thank you both for your generosity, for having walked together through the museum to prepare this as well. And I thank the audience for its fantastic questions and its presence. I welcome you all to some drinks and snacks that we have outside prepared for you, and for some informal conversation with Lynette before we whisk her away to the airport because she's leaving just this evening. But thank you again for coming and for your trust and continuing interest in what we do here at Kunsthalle Basel. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. It's really great.